And that's why Umar ibn Abdul Aziz said, be a scholar, a teacher, a learner, or somebody who helps them, facilitates the process. And then in another one it said, or one who just loves them. But don't be anybody else, because you'll perish. So that aspect is very important, the importance of learning and setting out for knowledge. But one of the things that he says constantly is that it is knowledge that makes us human. This is where the insaniya comes from, and he uses that word, insaniya. He says, without knowledge, we are like baha'im. We're like the beasts. It is knowledge that elevates us into the realm of insaniya. And then he mentions that the first step of learning is silence and listening, and then retention, and then practice, and then teaching. That you have to learn in a certain order. And then he gives us the evidence for the excellence of knowledge from reason. After he tells you what Allah said, what the Prophet ﷺ said, what the scholars have said, he gives you evidence of the excellence. And he tells us that knowledge is better than any other thing because of what's called the ziyada. He says that fadl, when you say al-ilmu afdalu min ghayrihi, knowledge is better than anything else. He says the fadl is ziyada. It's extra. It's what's extra. And he said when we say that the horse is better than the mule, both of them are beasts of burden. They can carry. But the horse has extra qualities. It can be used in war, and it's more beautiful. So he's saying that that's why we would say the horse is better, because of what's extra in it. And so he says knowledge is better. And he tells why. He said that a precious thing or desired object may be any of three categories: what's sought as a means to an end, what's sought for its own intrinsic value, and then what's sought for both, as a means and an end. And so knowledge is a means and an end. And there are aspects of knowledge that are clearly means, like the Arabic language is a means to understanding knowledge. And then he says that happiness in the hereafter and the ecstasy of witnessing the face of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are sought for their own intrinsic reason. That's their own intrinsic value. And that people are naturally disposed to honor their scholars. And then he goes on and talks, and this is one of the most interesting sections to me, is where he talks about the four sciences. And the first, there are four fundamental activities. He says if you look at the activities of the world, you have agriculture for raising foodstuffs, weaving or textiles for manufacturing clothes, architecture for erecting houses, and then politics for establishing human relationships and society. He says of these things, now if you ask what's the most important thing, a lot of people would say, oh, it's agriculture because we need food. He actually says the most important thing is politics from those. So that's the first category. The second category are auxiliary sciences. And those are things that help the other things. So for instance, metalworks helps agriculture because you need hoes and plows and things like that. Medicine also is something like that. And then the third are the supplementary. Those involve like milling and bread making, things like that. So you have agriculture, then you have the tools you need to do that, and then you have those things that complete it, like the baker who bakes the bread. And he shows how these are all important and necessary. And he likens them to body parts. He says the fundamental ones are like the heart and the brain and the liver. And then the auxiliary ones are like the stomach. And Imam al-Ghazali loves metaphors. He uses them all throughout the book. He's constantly using metaphors to drive points home in very visual images. And then he says the most important of these is politics. And then he says that politics are the politics of the rulers, but then the politics of the prophets. And he says the most important is the siyasa of the prophets. And he says because the siyasa of the prophets governs the minds as well as the actions of men, whereas the siyasa or the politics of the rulers only governs the actions of men. This is a very important distinction. And then he said the third category are the scholars, because they are the inheritors of the prophets, and they also govern the activities and the minds of people, because they're the ones that teach people. But then he says the ulama are really specifically towards those educated people, what he calls the khasa. And then he says the fourth category of the political people are the wa'al. They're the preachers on Friday, who give the Friday sermon. He said they also influence the minds of people, but they have no influence over the actions of the people. They influence the minds, they influence the actions in that they can get them to do things, but they can't go out and stop them from doing things. That's the government. And so he said that all of these have to be working with right knowledge, justice, equity, wisdom. And then he talks about the difference between the religious knowledges and then those knowledges that are useful for the worldly affairs. And then the next section, section 2, is what he says, those aspects of knowledge that are deemed fard ain. And this is important also because what he says is that when the Prophet ﷺ is saying seek knowledge, it's an obligation on every Muslim, seek knowledge even to China, he says this has been turned into, by the formalists, into all this outward stuff. And he said, I'm not denying the importance of that. And he will reiterate that. He said, don't misunderstand me. I'm not denigrating these other knowledges. But what I'm saying is you have forgotten what this affair is really about. This is about akhirah. And that is why you have made these things into something they are not. And he says, in the end, fiqh is about understanding. He said the Prophet ﷺ had 10,000 Sahaba when he entered Mecca. They were all Gnostics of God. But of those 10,000, only 10 of them gave fatwa. So he says, if this knowledge was just about fatwas and giving legal opinions, wouldn't the Prophet ﷺ have given that to all of his Sahaba? No. He was teaching them knowledge of the afterlife. And so he says that it's very important to recognize that, and then he gives to recognize the importance.